Hey there, fellow gamers. Welcome back to Akatsuki. Today, we're diving into the world of challenging action RPGs, and if you're a fan of Lords of the Fallen, you're in for a treat. We'll be exploring 10 games that offer a similar experience, from the dark and punishing to the epic and immersive. But before we jump into our list, let's quickly recap Lords of the Fallen. Developed by Deck 13 Interactive and CI Games, this game immerses players in a dark and challenging fantasy world filled with powerful foes and epic battles. As one of the more obvious answers, the Dark Souls trilogy is famous for having started the entire Souls-like genre that many fans have come to love. This series even set the first spark for what would become Lords of the Fallen. Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3 are all very similar, with minor differences in gameplay. Any fan of Lords of the Fallen will want to check out at least one of the Dark Souls games. The medieval fantasy trilogy has incredibly deep lore, amazing boss battles, and intense difficulty like any other From Software game. Salt and Sanctuary is one of the most popular Souls-like games out there, and even shares some similarities with Lords of the Fallen. One major difference between Salt and Sanctuary and Lords of the Fallen is that Salt and Sanctuary is a 2D platformer. But, the 2D dungeon crawling game is an amazing experience of fantasy combat. The difficulty of Salt and Sanctuary shares the difficulty of Lords of the Fallen, though the former has been regarded as even more difficult. The Star Wars Jedi series is an amazing cut of Star Wars video games. Star Wars Jedi Survivor has been regarded by many as the best Star Wars game for fans of the franchise to enjoy. It even shares similarities to Lords of the Fallen storytelling, combat, and boss difficulty. In Star Wars Jedi Survivor, players can navigate a variety of different planets as Jedi Cal Kestis, and battle it out with some of Star Wars' strongest opponents. With a wonderful narrative and enthralling combat, Star Wars Jedi Survivor is a must-play. Like Lords of the Fallen, Mortal Shell is a standalone video game that draws immense inspiration from Software titles like Dark Souls. That being said, Mortal Shell and Lords of the Fallen share the best similarities that they could. Each game's combat is compelling in their fantasy worlds. In Mortal Shell, gamers take on the role of the foundling in a dying world that they must attempt to survive, much like Dark Souls' story. The enemies in Mortal Shell are unforgiving, so players will want to proceed with heavy caution as they would in Lords of the Fallen. Some fans of Lords of the Fallen may like the game's narrative and setting more than other aspects. For those fans, Divinity: Original Sin 2 is an incredible game that makes for a magical time. Divinity: Original Sin 2 is played in the third person, and players will be able to create their own fantasy characters, along with choosing a class for said character. While gamers can fight through the fantasy world of Divinity: Original Sin 2 alone, the game is much more fun with friends. This fantasy RPG offers players a flexible narrative that changes based on players' decisions, which is one of the game's most compelling features. Being one of the most popular From Software games, Elden Ring is one of the best choices for fans of Lords of the Fallen. What makes Elden Ring much more unique and ambitious than other From Software games is that Elden Ring is open world. In Elden Ring's vast world, players can engage in a ton of different content, whether it is the game's main quest lines or Elden Ring's side content like dungeons or side quests. Elden Ring is also regarded as fairly difficult, so fans will want to prepare for vicious boss fights and aggressive enemies. The Lord of the Rings franchise is one of the most well-known and popular fantasy franchises of all time, and its presence has even reached the gaming world. Middle-earth: Shadow of War is a direct sequel to Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor, both of which feature narratives from Tolkien's fantasy novels. Middle-earth: Shadow of War is an incredible third-person game that throws players into an open world that is created from Tolkien's novels. As Talion, gamers must take on a variety of enemies and bosses while being compelled by the game's amazing story. The Elder Scrolls V: Skyrim is one of the most famous games in history for its genre-defining content. In its time, Skyrim was one of the best-looking games, has a hallmark-worthy story, is filled with side content and secrets, and overall has one of the best video game experiences that fans can get into. Specifically for Lords of the Fallen fans, Skyrim has a wonderful setting within an open world of pure fantasy, and allows players to take on the land's many enemies in either third or first person. Skyrim is a great option to consider when looking for RPG adventure games. As one of CD Projekt Red's most valuable assets, The Witcher 3, Wild Hunt is one of the best action RPG games in the market. Derived from the series of fantasy adventure novels, The Witcher 3, Wild Hunt is an amazing choice for any fan of Lords of the Fallen. It offers fans a large open world filled to the brim with content, enemies to scout out and fight against, and bosses to overpower. Not to mention, the game's story is one of the best fantasy narratives for fiction fans. The Witcher 3, Wild Hunt can also be fairly difficult, especially when played on the highest difficulty settings. When it comes to Souls-like games, Nioh is one of the most highly regarded, even though it's easier than Souls games. Nioh is an action game filled with inspiration from FromSoftware titles. Nioh first came out in 2017, and Nioh 2 was released in 2020. The game received heavy applause for its beloved fundamentals exercised from FromSoftware games, as well as original ideas that make the game even better. Lords of the Fallen will no doubt fall in love with the incredible story and gameplay that Nioh has to offer. Set in early Japan, gamers will have a blast becoming samurai while fighting against monstrous enemies. And that wraps up our list of games similar to Lords of the Fallen. Whether you prefer the punishing difficulty, immersive storytelling, or epic open worlds, there's a game on this list for you. Be sure to let us know in the comments which one you're most excited to play. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell to stay updated with more gaming content from Akatsuki. Until next time, happy gaming!